We'll use this slide as a way to think about asexual reproduction versus sexual reproduction. So, when it comes to asexual reproduction, there is a female that can give rise to offspring, and each of the offspring that they produce are capable of giving rise to more and more offspring as we go through each subsequent generation. So there's an ability to expand upon the generation without the need to find a potential mating partner. So asexual reproduction can provide a pretty simple way for the organism to make a ton of copies of itself. And when it comes to the benefit of that, if an animal can reproduce asexually, then if it's isolated from other organisms within its species, that doesn't matter because it's able to still generate more offspring even when that event occurs. Or if the animal is really not motile, so its ability to look for a potential mate is really reduced, that won't matter because it doesn't have to look for another mate in order to generate offspring. And individuals can reproduce pretty rapidly because they don't need to seek out a mate. Now, one thing I will say is that when it comes to an organism that can produce asexually, it's still possible for some of them to go through sexual reproduction as well, with the hydra being an example of that. So let's say that, the hydra is not capable of finding a mate. It doesn't have to utilize a sexual reproductive route. It can instead go through asexual reproduction, and there's still no loss of that particular organism because it's able to contribute within each subsequent round of budding that takes place, is able to expand its population. So asexual reproduction is great for generating a large number of offspring. But when it comes to the idea of asexual reproduction, you would expect it to be taking place in areas that are relatively stable. And what I mean when I say stable is that there's not a ton of fluctuations that an organism would need to respond and evolve. So when we're going through asexual reproduction, there's not an ability to select for, a particular organism within a species due to some type of advantage that it may have. So it's just going to keep on making exact replicas of itself. So if environmental conditions change, if this copy is no longer able to acquire what it needs to remain viable, then that can be a significant disadvantage. So if there's a ton of changes that are going along or taking place, then an organism that is depending exclusively on asexual reproduction to generate offspring would have a disadvantage once environmental conditions change. But asexual reproduction is largely beneficial for an organism that wants to produce a ton of offspring, doesn't need to look for a mate in order to do so, and is in an environment in which there's really little fluctuation or changes in condition that would require some type of evolution or modification in their overall genetic makeup. On the right-hand side is sexual reproduction. And in this illustration, what we're seeing is that in sexual reproduction, the female is only capable of producing half as many offspring-bearing progeny. So the possibility as female and male, the male cannot give rise to another generation in the sense of being able to carry the offspring, give birth to the offspring. So there's a reduction in the kind of proliferative capacity of organisms that utilize sexual reproduction. So we see as we go through each generation, we don't have as many offspring that are seen here. In addition, sexual reproduction is thought to have unique costs when compared to asexual reproduction, in that males and females require specialized body parts in order to mate with each other. They also need to find one another in order to successfully mate and generate a large amount of gametes. So the question then becomes, why are we using this mechanism? And a lot of this, in terms of the response, comes from our knowledge of meiosis. So sexual reproduction allows for greater genetic variation. There's genetic recombination. There's a law of independent assortment, the law of segregation, all of those things helping to contribute to generating offspring that has diversity. So there can be a better ability to adapt to environmental changes as compared to asexual reproduction. Some combinations of alleles may promote survival or reproduction, and those can be upheld and seen through subsequent generations. There is also likely that some combinations will not promote survival or reproduction, but there's the ability to select for those that do. So sexual reproduction is providing genetic diversity, which allows these types of organisms to exist within an environment in which changes can occur and the organisms can adapt and evolve with those changes. Concept 46.2, fertilization depends on mechanisms that bring together sperm and eggs of the same species. So, when we think about fertilization, there is external fertilization and internal fertilization. And when it comes to the process of both, there needs to be a habitat with moisture that's present in order for the gametes to effectively meet with one another. So we can see that with the external fertilization. In this process, we have frogs, and the male will grasp the female frog and discharge fluids that contain sperm onto the eggs as the female is releasing them into the water. So that's what we see taking place here. When it comes to organisms that utilize internal fertilization, this is largely an adaptation to environmental change. And so when it comes to organisms that transition and result in organisms that live on land or terrestrial organisms in contrast to water, there needs to be an evolution of how fertilization takes place in order to avoid desiccation. So desiccate meaning to dry out, because if these gametes dry out, then they're not going to be able to successfully meet with one another and generate further offspring. So when it comes to the process of internal fertilization, the idea is a way to introduce those gametes directly to one another, and in doing so, bypass any possibility of desiccation occurring. So direct passing of male gametes into the female reproductive system is how internal fertilization is able to allow for these gametes to meet one another to produce offspring. So both of these are mechanisms in which we can achieve fertilization, but in both, the tie-in idea here is that the habitat or surroundings in which these gametes need to meet one another needs to be an aqueous one. When it comes to internal fertilization, which is the mechanism that we utilize, it helps to enhance the survival of offspring. So if we imagine that a bunch of eggs are being released into the water and that those eggs are being fertilized, it's entirely possible for the sperm to diffuse away from the eggs, or for the eggs to be ingested by a nearby predator. So when it comes to internal fertilization, while there are fewer gametes that are produced, the survival rate is much higher. And again, for different reasons when we compare that to external fertilization, right? So even if we're thinking about external fertilization, the reason why there's so many eggs is that they know that they're not all going to make it to a viable organism. And so they're kind of hedging their bets with that fertilization process. So internal fertilization, less gametes, but a higher likelihood of survival. And when it comes to internal fertilization, there are various mechanisms that help to protect the embryo, because this is a really, kind of sensitive state that they are in as they're going through these really important processes of cell division and cell differentiation. So we want to ensure that they are protected and that they are cared for during that sensitive time. Here are some different strategies that are utilized for offspring development in organisms that use internal fertilization. And these vocabulary terms are important to know. These are not terms that you will find within the Camel book, so they're specific to the VoiceThread slide. So there is the first one. So we have oviparity, which means that you have eggs that go through the process of fertilization internally, but the process of developing and ultimately hatching or getting out of that egg is going to occur externally. So a common example would be birds, right? So birds will go through a process of internal fertilization, but then they'll lay those fertilized eggs, and those will continue their development outside of the body of that organism. In ovoviviparity, you have fertilized eggs, and those fertilized eggs will stay in the body until they're ready to hatch. And when it comes to their source of nourishment, it's all derived from the egg yolk. So for ovoviviparity, it's still internal fertilization. All of these are examples of internal fertilization. The egg will stay inside until it's ready to hatch, and all of the nourishment that the growing embryo will receive is derived from the egg yolk. In viviparity, there is internal fertilization where young development is going to occur internally. So we're not depositing the egg in this scenario. And the source of nourishment is coming directly from the maternal blood rather than the egg yolk. So in this scenario, we would be an example of an organism that utilizes viviparity as a form of internal fertilization for offspring development. And there's utilization of the placenta. So that's the structure through which blood and gas exchange is going to occur. And here we can see that in the shark. So this is the shark being born. In this scenario, you can still see the umbilical cord attached to the mom here. So when looking at these examples, you're thinking about 3 examples that utilize internal fertilization, but the timing of when the offspring leaves the mom changes. So pretty much they are provided to you in terms of increased time spent within the mom. So for oviparity, it's almost immediate post internal fertilization that the egg is released, and it still needs to do the majority of its development outside of the mom. For the ovoviviparity, the bulk of development takes place inside, and then right before it's about to hatch, the egg is released. And for the viviparity, all of that development occurs internally. And essentially, once the offspring is released, it should be able to behave independent of the mother. When it comes to these modules, one last topic is the idea of gamete production and delivery. And this is just going to introduce us to some of the important vocabulary terms that we will reestablish when we go through the male reproductive system and the female reproductive system. So for sexual reproduction, there needs to be the production of gametes through precursor cells. We have discussed the idea of germ cells being able to give rise to gametes and the distinction between a germ cell and a gamete. And that's a discussion that is relevant for meiosis, and we will talk about the process of generating gametes, whether it's sperm cells or egg cells later on. And when it comes to the organs that are responsible for that gamete production, those are gonads. So we're focusing on human physiology, so we're not going to go over examples of organisms that don't have gonads. I've just left this bullet point in just for more for edification, but our emphasis again is going to be on human reproductive system and human embryonic development. So when it comes to gamete production and delivery, we generate those gametes utilizing gonads, and then in order to deliver those gametes, there's going to be accessories. So there's going to be a duct system, there are going to be glands that will be secreting content that can help to facilitate movement of the gametes, help to nourish and protect those gametes and eventually those developing embryos. And so you want to utilize this particular slide and ask yourself, okay, so now when I'm going through my male and female reproductive system, what are my examples of gonads? What are my different examples of ducts and glands that help to facilitate the movement of gamete from one organism to another in order to achieve a successful fertilization event? We'll start with the human male reproductive system and begin with the anatomy. When it comes to the male reproductive system, the ultimate goal is to produce sperm and then introduce that sperm into the female body. And when it comes to reproductive organs, they're classified as external or internal. And this is largely based on its location. So when it comes to male external reproductive organs, that consists of the scrotum and penis. The internal organs will consist of gonads. Gonads are going to be those gamete-producing organs. There will also be production of hormones that will allow us to make connections with the endocrine system chapter. There will be accessory glands that are essential for helping to generate all of the content that is found within sperm. And then there will be ducts that allow for the sperm and secretions that are coming from those glands to conduct the contents out of the male body. Concept 46.3, reproductive organs produce and transport gametes. So when it comes to this concept, we are going to go through both the male and female reproductive organs and the mechanism by which they are able to generate gametes, so the process of gametogenesis, and then their subsequent transport through their respective reproductive systems until they can meet one another for that fertilization event. He will go through some of the components of human male reproductive anatomy, and then in upcoming images, we'll add in a little bit more detail. So, first, we'll go through the testes, which are the male gonads that are responsible for sperm production, and the testes are housed within the scrotum. When it comes to the testes, they are usually not symmetrical. One will be suspended a little bit lower than the other one. And the idea behind this is that the asymmetrical distribution is meant to prevent compression. So if they were aligned at the same location, it will be much easier for compression to occur. This is the site of sperm production. So we want to ensure that the gonads are as safe as possible. So this would be kind of a form and function response to kind of optimizing sperm production. In addition to having that asymmetrical distribution, we find that the scrotum, which houses the testes, is found kind of distended from the abdominal pelvic cavity of the individual. And this helps to kind of regulate temperature. And when it comes to sperm production, it needs to be a little bit cooler than what we find within the body. So having the scrotum being distended in this way helps to optimize that sperm production. In addition, the scrotum has a septum, and that will kind of comparable to when we talked about the cardiovascular system, and there was a septum or a way to divide between the ventricles. In this scenario, we're creating a division between the testes, and that can help to protect each testes from being infected by the other if an infection does occur. Next, we'll go through the ducts. And when it comes to ducts, this is all about moving sperm through the reproductive tract. And so the components of the duct will be the epididymis, the ductus deferens, the ejaculatory duct, and the urethra. And this is all heading towards the outside of the body, ultimately exiting out through the opening found within the penis. And when it comes to the urethra, something to keep in mind is that this tract for reproduction is the same tract that would be utilized for urination. So the urinary bladder is shown here, and for the morning class, we went through osmoregulation and the urinary system. So when we utilize the term urethra here, it is the same urethra that we discussed within chapter 44. Another category that we'll add in just a little bit more detail in subsequent voice thread slides are the accessory glands. And these include the seminal vesicle, the prostate gland, and the bulbourethral gland, or the Cowper's gland, depending on which literature you go through. And accessory glands are responsible for adding secretions to the previously discussed ducts during the process of ejaculation. So the seminal vesicle accounts for the bulk of semen volume. The prostate gland is going to play a role in sperm activation, and you can see how the prostate gland kind of encircles or envelops the urethra. And then there's the bulbourethral gland, which produces mucus that can help to neutralize any residual urine that's found within the urethra too. Now, my comment about the positioning of the prostate gland is relevant just in thinking about discussions as they might relate to maybe prostate cancer. So if you were to think about, where the prostate is located relative to the urinary system of the male, you can now start to think about what are some types of means of a readout in which we can say, okay, perhaps there's something going on with the prostate just based on its general localization and what impact it might have on the urinary system. And collectively, when thinking about the human male reproductive anatomy, the external genitalia is composed of the penis, of which here is depicting the erectile tissue, and we'll talk about the changes that occur within this tissue during the different phases associated with reproduction in a later voice thread. So the erectile tissue of the penis can constitute part of that external anatomy as well as the scrotum. Everything else is considered internal genitalia. So let's make a point of distinguishing between external and internal genitalia as it relates to the male reproductive anatomy, and we'll also do the same for the female reproductive anatomy. For this particular slide, we'll go through the testes, but then also mention several of the ducts because they're illustrated here. So the testes is going to be divided into lobules, and those lobules or regions are referred to as seminiferous tubules. So seminiferous tubules, you can see they're pretty convoluted. There's lots of folding that is occurring here. These are sites where sperm is generated. Now, when it comes to the testes, they produce sex hormones as well as sperm, and the seminiferous tubules are going to have between them some clusters of endocrine cells. So that'll be the source of testosterone. That's not shown in this illustration. So there are endocrine roles as well as exocrine roles that are seen within the testes. When it comes to the seminiferous tubules, they have germinal epithelial tissue. So that's going to have several layers of germ cells. And the importance of germ cells as it relates to sperm production has already been discussed during the spermatogenesis slide. Now, when it comes to the seminiferous tubules, they're going to lead to a rete testes. So you can see that here in the more orange area. And when it comes to this particular area, I'd like you to kind of notice the location. So it's found on the posterior side of the testes. It's near the encapsulated region, and it's a site of partial maturation and sperm movement that is kind of originating or starting from the epididymis is going to move based on fluid secretions by cells that are there to help accommodate the sperm, and there's some cilia that's there. So when we think about sperm cells and motility or illustrations or videos that show that movement, sperm cells don't swim in the way that we like think about them in a canonical sense while they're in the male reproductive tract. So there are things that are helping to achieve that sperm migration. After the rete testes, you can see that there are these efferent ductules, and they arise from the testes and help to carry sperm towards the epididymis. And there are ciliated cells there as well that help to drive that sperm movement. Now, when we think of the epididymis, there are different portions of it, and you can see that there's a lot of terms that end in epididymis here. But essentially, when thinking about the epididymis, there are several portions. There is a head, a long middle portion called the body, a small inferior portion called the tail, and these are regions in which sperm will mature and where sperm can be stored. And the process of maturation takes place as sperm makes its way through the head of the epididymis and the body of the epididymis. And once the sperm reaches the tail, that's where it can be stored along with a small portion of the vas deferens, and two regions in which sperm can be stored. But if they reach their lifespan and haven't been utilized, so if the process of ejaculation they haven't been used, then they will end up being reabsorbed by the epididymis. So there is a lifespan on them. Once they reach that lifespan and ejaculation hasn't occurred, then they become reabsorbed. Now, the ductus deferens, or the vas deferens, that's shown here in this illustration, it will just from our perspective, take it as a muscular tube that's going to pass upwards towards the spermatic cord. So in thinking about this particular image, there's a lot of anatomy, and this is already leaving out far more that can be found in the male reproductive system. But I do want you to think about where things are located, the high level of folding, and how that contributes to the idea of surface area and volume, and the capacity for sperm production as well as sperm storage.